Our style of farming tends to move in the direction of having lots and lots of plants very close to one another in really complex and dense relationships. Very high levels of diversity and complexity, although it's a little bit challenging management-wise, tends to offer up a lot of resilience. So like for example, we can harvest tons and tons of salad from here. Maybe that will fail, maybe not, but we've been having a nice time with that. And in the middle we can have our nursery crop, which is Siberian peaches growing, or we've got poppies growing amongst American plums with red lettuce on the edges. In other words, lots and lots of different plants near one another, but if we just let everything grow completely unabated, we'll have problems. So we harvest lettuce frequently to make sure there's light for the plums. Or at some point soon, I'll need to go through and take this volunteer sweet cherry, which is growing extremely tall, and cut it back and feed it to the plants below so that it can be a little bit of a more controlled trellis for this Niagara grape. It works really nicely to have a cherry holding a grape, but we need to manage that cherry so that both characters can work together. Lots of pruning to be done. So to that end, back in the spring, I made a video talking about specific pruning considerations on one character in this very diverse cast, that of the elderberry. I'll link to that here for your reference. If you haven't seen that, you might want to watch that first so you can see the discussion back when the plants were dormant. What I'd like to do in this video is a deep dive, a thoughtful discussion of what those pruning cuts did. So now we're in early July, so halfway through the growing season. How did those elderberries respond to that cutting? And some things that didn't work about it that I want to make sure I share. I'm going to start here with an example that I think it really demonstrates part of the reason why you want to prune elderberry in particular, but this also would apply for other shrubby plants like currants and things like that, that after a number of years, I'm not going to give exact numbers, but let's, I'll throw out 5 years, 6 years of an elderberry growing, it can start to wind down. So for example, here is one. This is wildwood, which is mainly an American type of elderberry. And if it was just on its own, you might think, oh, that's growing pretty nicely, that's decent. It's a little tall, a little spindly, there's a fair bit of space underneath. This is a minimally pruned elderberry, and it's starting to wind down. And if it doesn't get pruned hard this next year, it'll start to actually pass away from not having renewal wood. To the right of it here, or to the east, this is a scotia, which was cut extremely hard this spring. So all of this green growth that you're looking at is the vigorous renewal growth from having been cut. It's kind of hard to get in there. You can see some of the original old stems, so next year we'll cut it the rest of the way. But most of this was cut down to about 1 or 2 feet. And some of the leaves really down low in here are having some problems. We can either pull them off and use them as mulch or leave it. But the overall picture is that of an extremely reinvigorated elderberry. So all of this growth from this year, and then just a little bit of growth on the one next to it. So we'll cut this back a little bit again. Maybe I'll even feed some of that to this wildwood this season, and then next year we'll make sure we cut this wildwood back to get that kind of renewal growth. It's very invigorating for these plants when they're dormant. We've learned over time that American elderberry types, which are most of the ones that are out there, the native types, do very well to be cut flush to ground or close to ground every 2 years or 3 years, or at least have dead or decaying wood removed every single year. And we like to do that in the spring. We're in central New York State, tend to do it March, early April before they push new growth. We don't like to do it dead of winter where the cuts get more exposed to cold for a very long time without growth. But we don't do that cutting normally in the middle of the season, but there are exceptions. So I look on the other side of this ridiculously wonderful but overly abundant growing scotia. Right now I'm walking through a patch of black cap raspberry, so I'm a little slow. So this plant is growing with tons and tons of vigor, and on the north side of it here, if you imagine the day's sunlight coming through, to the north by a few feet is a very high value bed for us of Swiss chard, lettuce, and then in the center, newly sown American persimmon seedlings. Now these are semi-shade tolerant, but they're not deep shade tolerant. And what I want to make sure happens is that this elderberry's super vigorous growth doesn't slow down this persimmon. So I don't want to make sure that just the desires of this single plant determine what I do for the desires and needs of every other plant in the system. So I'm going to look for some branches here that are really leaning and cut them and feed them to the persimmon. This is the kind of thing where I don't want to do it all the time. I don't want to do it as my main pruning work for the season, but a little bit of adjustment as we go, with some thoughtful snips, especially with these really leaning branches. A little hard to film as I go. I'll grab the tripod for some of the other sections I want to prune. But there we go. So we've got some material here that can now be fed to the persimmons. Now I can go through and break this down as much as I want. I could also just use my hands to fold it over and lay it. We had a really good rain yesterday. I put some compost in this bed recently, and so I can chop this material up and feed this as a mulch to these persimmons. A pretty small amount there, but you can see in the little space between the persimmons and the lettuces where there was compost added and a nice rain, there's now some some nice rich green manure mulch, and tons more that could be pruned in here. But I'm not going to be doing these sorts of cuts all the time. It's just to allow light releases and also build soil while we're at it. That pattern happens extensively through here. So here is a volunteer redbud in the landscape that is acting as a semi-trellis for these peach cap, black cap raspberries, which are at their peak growing moment. And so I've been liberating light and resources to the peach cap as they need to ripen by cutting some of the redbud and feeding those branches and those leaves down and around, working around the lettuces and things down below. But we're leveraging the body of the redbud and liberating some nitrogen to feed these peach caps. But let me get back to the elder talk. Now moving towards our chicken yard, take a quick detour to look at these two beautiful Nanking cherries. We've already picked hundreds and hundreds of fruits from these. Really nice to be reminded, Nanking cherry can crop heavily in partial shade. We're looking east, and that's a pin oak. Lots and lots of shade in here, but still a very productive plant. I need to cut some of those branches because they're too overloaded with the weight of fruit. And that segues me to the problem/interest of what happened with some of the elderberry pruning in this space. This is a very, very highly nutrified zone, triggers some extremely fast growth on plants. But there isn't a ton of sunlight, so some of the plants grow a little bit more spindly than would be ideal. So this is an elderberry. In the first video I talked about pruning this back quite a bit, just like that Scotia. But in here, there's a little less sunlight, so it grew even more than the Scotia. Very high nutrient, very high water availability, but not tons of sun. And so it built itself with a little bit of weakness. And what ended up happening, some of these branches broke. It was just too much growth. What I should have done is thinned this quite a bit, but I didn't, and so the wind and gravity thinned it by dragging these branches down. So this has to get cleaned up. There are a lot of branches in here that are broken or kind of broken. So for example, you can see how that just broke over. That's not going to serve the plant in the long run, so it really needs to go. If the camera's shaking while I'm doing this, it's because chickens are pecking the base of it. But it's a fair bit of cleanup in here. The nice thing though is all this material that isn't going to serve this elderberry to grow really well can be amazing to be used as a mulch for other plants. So it's a management stroke that also is definitely a harvest pretty much every time. A lot of material. If only the chickens ate elderberry leaves, that would be useful to them. We would just leave it here, but they don't. So we just planted some really nice cultivar mulberries in these rings that are ultimately meant to feed the hens and also provide some shade. So I'm going to use the elderberries as mulch around these rings. Very rough application, but absolutely fine enough for a chicken yard. Could send this through like a little electric chipper or use a machete to chop it up more finely if I wanted to feed cabbages or tomatoes or a finer annual crop. But in a ring around the mulberries, it'll slowly break down, it'll protect the soil from the hens pecking at it, and it'll feed them. Meanwhile, this is cleaned up a little bit and the chickens still have all their shade. I would do well to probably thin this out almost to 50%. Because the growth is so numerous and so vigorous, more of these will fail. But rather than doing that preemptively, I've got other things to do. I'll just let that happen and we'll clean it up if they do. Here is the southern and then the western end of our front yard little nursery area. So some of you folks that have come this season to pick up bare root plants or potted plants may find this area familiar. By the way, quick heads up, we still have some potted plants. We've got beautiful sweet cherries and sour cherries and Tovnica apples and elderberries and English walnuts. Send me a message if you're interested in seeing these plants and picking them up for your spot. But anyway, the potted plant area is flanked by these elderberries. There's 4 Marge in here, and there's 6 to 8 Scotia over here. Let's look at Marge first. It's a little difficult to unpack what's actually happening in here because it's so dense. It really is amazing how much elders respond. But again, all of this is new growth for this season, and a reminder why you want to do these renewal cuts once in a while. This will happen to be a lower pollarding cut. This is older wood in here, and so there's lots and lots of new shoots coming up. It's about 3 or 4 feet tall, these stumps. Ultimately, we'll want to cut them flush to ground one of these years, but these 3 plants all got the same treatment, and the goal was to hide our firewood shed from the road. I would say that they are doing that, so you can kind of see a little bit there, but basically these elderberries cut roughly here to regrow, really filled in a visual barrier within the first season in a beautiful way. So we want flowers, we want fruit, but we also wanted that visual privacy and the sense of holding the space, and that sort of cut really facilitated that, all within really 3 months of the first season. The westernmost of the 4 Marge, I did a different treatment when I talked about it in the original video. It's a little bit more of a standard pruning style. This was cut flush to ground. In other words, coppiced or hard cut flush to ground. And so everything in from that stump up in this area is Marge regrowth from March until July. So it's about 8 feet tall. It will flower intensely in fruit next year. It's a little bit European genetics, so they don't fruit and flower, or flower and fruit on their first year wood, but the second. But this is a very strong response, and I might do well to go in and thin these a little bit. We'll see if I have time to do so. This wall of Scotia on the west has been so successful in growing that it actually made it so that the walkway is gone. I definitely need to prune it in order to have our walkway back. Pretty immense amount of regrowth, lots and lots of material up high that'll be flowers and fruit for the birds. I like to let some of these get way above our head so we're not even tempted to pick them, and then pruning so that renewal growth is closer to us, but also getting this walkway back, and again getting this yield of an immense amount of green manure. I'm going to use this to protect the soil in a high tunnel. We've got a whole bunch of hot peppers and marjoram, tomatoes and basil, and these leaves would do a really great job of protecting that. You can see where redbud leaves and locust, river locust and such have been cut up to cover the soil after watering thoroughly in here. So it's got grass clippings, redbud, all sorts of nice things, and the elderberry would add more to this. I don't need to do a time lapse, I'm just going to do it. To me, that's a pretty fun sight. There's really nice cultivar habaneros every 2 feet or so on a little zigzag in here. Marjoram on the south to be the ground cover coming out over the walkway. There's African marigolds as aromatic confusers and neat seed stock, as well as papalo, which is a lovely South American herb for salsas. All being protected, the soil protected in here with a little bit of prunings, probably like 5% of the total regrowth this year from a few Scotia elderberries. Juan went through and soaked the heck out of the soil yesterday. We put grass clippings down and redbud, so the elderberry will protect it even further. And that is definitively more than enough discussion for one day on elderberry. Takeaway that I would like to offer up: plants are amazing. They could be planted really close to one another so long as you're comfortable with entering into a relationship of lots of pruning. You cut a little of this, feed it to that. Reduce the canopy here, feed it to that one. Oh, that one died, let that one expand out and do its work. So very close plantings, I can say from direct experience, seems to create the best health and vigor overall for everyone, so long as you're pruning as well. So hope you're out there snipping a little, observing and interacting, and have a jungle forming around you filled with delicious snacks and medicine and allies. Take care.